Welcome back, everyone, to the now fourth video in our series about liberalism and firearms policy. To recap, in part one, I looked at the statistics around the causal effect of firearms on violence, concluding that relative freedom to own firearms as a private citizen does not cause any measurable increase in violence. In part 1a, I had a side explanation of South African firearms law and the relationship between group identity and behavior. In part 2, I started a thought experiment dealing with the seeming counterfactual "what if we were wrong" about the causal statistics in part 1, and explaining why, even if we were wrong, there would still be good reasons why strict gun control is inconsistent with progressive liberal politics. We started that with a discussion of the relationship between police and the rest of society, which we will continue here. So we have established that the police are definitively civilians, and we should resist vigorously anything that attempts to recast them as non-civilians. Now let's go back to that argument from Mr. Harsh Gun Control. If you remember, it often follows the form, police need access to firearms in a way that, well, let's strengthen his argument. Let's say private citizens instead of civilians. In a way that private citizens don't. I would certainly agree that on any given day, the odds of a typical police officer being in a situation where the sort of defensive capacity that a firearm offers would be useful is probably higher than your typical private citizen, and thus on any specific day they are more likely to need it than most people. But what exactly is this typical cop or typical private citizen like? I guarantee that none of us either has met or will meet such a person. One of the great truths of social research is this: the typical subject doesn't exist. Of course, that's a bit simplistic. There may be many individuals who are pretty close to the average, typical, normal subject. But the important truth in it is that while we may treat the entire population as if it were made up of the typical subject for some purposes, assuming that the typical subject describes the individual members of the population well is a very bad idea. It's like building doors in your building that are 5'8" because the average height in your country is 5'7½". It'll serve some people fine, but don't be surprised at a lot of bruised heads and swearing. Similarly, while as a population police constables are more likely to have to forcibly defend themselves than other people, that tells us nothing about the likelihood of any individual needing to do so. And that likelihood, in turn, doesn't tell us whether or not such an event will happen. That we will only know after the fact, in a sort of Aeschylean call no man happy until he's dead kind of a way. There are constables who go through their entire careers never having to fire a shot or swing a baton in anger, which I think we can all agree is the best possible outcome. And there are private citizens who've had to use a high degree of force several times in their lives to defend themselves, who then needed the capacity to apply that force. The population likelihood method would give us entirely the wrong answer to that question, and I suspect that most people making the claim that the police are the ones who need firearms claim would not argue that the post facto knowledge that our lucky hypothetical constable didn't need one can play a role in our future-looking assessment of his or her need at any point in their career before retirement. Equally invalid would be an argument that those private citizens did not or would not need them. Now, getting a little autobiographical here, my main exploration of this idea, the idea that there should be a requirement to articulate and compare needs, comes from some online discussions I was involved with regarding knife possession laws in the UK. The people who supported those extremely restrictive laws said that they never needed to use knives outside the house and didn't see why anyone else would need to, and thus why anyone should be permitted to. So the question they posed was, why do you need to carry a knife? Several people responded with any number of things that they either needed or could see themselves needing a pocket knife for when out and about. The immediate reply from those supporting harsh restrictions was, no, that's stuff you might need it for on a given day. Why would you? Or why should you be permitted to carry one unless you would need it on that day. Lest anyone think I'm being uncharitable, I've scarcely paraphrased that at all. That is exactly the challenge posed, requiring not only that it be answered, but answered to their satisfaction, with, let's be honest, no possibility of that satisfaction being reached. I hope you can all appreciate the problem with that question. It's basically another version of the comparison I made between our lucky constable and our unlucky private citizen a few minutes ago. Making claims before the fact about whether or not we think they need a firearm or a pocket knife or whatever after the fact is impossible. Or rather, we can make any claim we like before the fact, but it's a question of dumb luck whether we will eventually prove to have been right or not. To put it another way, betting enough times on which of a pair of people will turn out to need to defend themselves forcibly, betting on the constable will win you more money than you'll lose in the long run. Betting on just one pair once, however, and it's far more of a crapshoot. Betting on them as individuals rather than as a pair, which is what we really have to do, is nigh impossible. And this kind of failure of our probability assessment module, treating single cases as if they were massively iterated, is endemic to human problem solving. It's why problem gamblers think that streaks exist. And the problem of treating single instances as if we're comparing pairs is one of the reasons that identity parades produce so many false positives. But given the time and the space to deliberate, surely we should try to insulate our policy decisions from these cognitive flaws. So having established this, where does that leave the need part of this only police argument for firearms control? I'm certainly satisfied that it leaves it on very shaky ground indeed. Certainly most, one would wish all, private firearms owners will never need to use one defensively. But some do. And our guesses about whether or not that need will arise for any one of them carries approximately the weight of a gnat's fart. So having dealt with the so-called cop versus civilian distinction and the need distinction, let's see what's left. So, comparison of cops and civilians, check, dealt with. Cops need firearms but civilians don't, check, dealt with. And, next bit, and have the capacity and training to do so responsibly that civilians lack. Okay, that's the last bit of that argument. In a simplistic three-word nutshell, no they don't. This bit won't see a lot of picking apart of terminology and political principle. It's just a question of ignorance, and I don't mean that in a judgmental way. Not knowing something about the world isn't necessarily a problem, because it lets us learn new stuff, and that's fun. But people making this argument are massively, massively mistaken about the skill levels required of armed cops. It's touching that they think so highly of our police services, but also puzzling that people on the progressive left, who are normally suspicious of government and police exercises of power, should be so uncritical in this area. Now, this is not to say that there aren't many members of various police services who aren't extremely competent, no doubt much more so than your average, again that word average, private person. But, and this is the important bit, they are generally not required to be. Many others aren't, and that's okay. I've got a selection here of annual qualification standards for various police departments around the US. I would have loved to get the standards for the South African police and for the UK armed officer qualifications, but I couldn't get hold of them. It's not like you could pass them without being able to shoot at all, but skimming through them, they're not hugely tough. I haven't held a firearm in over a year, and I'm confident that I could pass a fair proportion of them with a few weeks' practice. Not all, of course, some look really hard. I'd like to single out the Federal Air Marshal's test here as one that makes me sweat just looking at it. To go through them with you would take more time. I'd intended to, but there are lots of very specific instructions and requirements for each component of the test, so that would be a whole video on its own. For now, I'd just like you to accept my judgment that most of them are reasonably attainable by most people with a little practice and a little guidance. In fact, I might try some of these out in the next month or so and report back to you on how I did. Cue my exceedingly red face if I fail them all, I'm sure. A number of people who write about these standards, as I found in doing my research, are extremely critical of them and would like the training and testing to be tightened up. They often reference poor performance in cases of public violence and incidents in which bystanders are injured or killed by cops. Of course, such incidents couldn't happen, but what are reasonable expectations for us to have of police officers? There are specialized units with extremely high training standards. I understand the South African Police Special Task Force is exceptionally competent and exceptionally professional, as are other units in several countries. But that's not everyone. And even for those units, their high standards do not prevent incidents such as the police shooting of Jean de Menezes. But I think that we'd all agree that, ceteris paribus, higher degrees of skill are better. As with many of my arguments, however, the issue is that the ceteris are very seldom paribus. It would be possible to train some members of some police services to a much higher degree of skill than is currently being done, certainly. But what would be required for that to happen, and what would the other effects be? Currently, training for police officers is limited by the resources available for it, obviously. Those resources are time, money, available training expertise, which of course is related to money, so not an entirely independent factor, and candidate motivation or talent. Training in the initial academy-based environment and then on-the-job continuous training is time that cannot be used for other things, either in studying other skills and knowledge areas critical for a constable's role or in actually doing the work. Further, high-level training requires significant expenditure in, I've grown to understand, stonkingly expensive ammunition, hiring experts who are in high demand, and often the construction or use of specialized facilities. All of these resources, if dedicated to firearms training specifically, cannot be used in any other training function or any other overall function of the police department. That expenditure only makes sense if one begins to think of the use of a firearm as one of the core functions of the constabulary. And as I've discussed before and wish to emphasize again, I think that's a very dangerous idea, and one that liberals should be extremely nervous about. The best traditions of law enforcement warn us against that model. And if we were to encourage society to think of the police that way, as definitionally weapon users, then naturally the police, as embedded members of that society, will think of themselves that way too. The old saying goes, if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, but for this argument let's rework it in a slightly more sophisticated way. If you've been taught to think of yourself as a hammer professional first, then it doesn't really matter if you have anything else. The hammer will be what you reach for first. So let's rather not teach cops that they are use of hammer professionals. Let's teach them to be carpenters instead. That was a bit of a loop away from the main argument, but important to explain how my thinking works and why my arguments are, I think, more broadly important outside of firearms policy. So to summarize today's video, the claim that the police have a markedly greater need and ability to use firearms more safely than private individuals fails to hold water. Need is an extremely difficult thing to quantify and impossible to judge on an individual level in these kinds of circumstances. Trained ability is slightly easier to assess, but when we do, we see that the minimum requirements for the police are not particularly high in general. Of course, again, the trained level of many specialized officers is higher, although I've read some scary things from various police trainers in doing my research for this about barely competent but very confident SWAT teams. And indeed the skill levels of many general patrol cops is higher as well. But that's because those individuals have the talent and the interest to push themselves in that area, just as many private firearms owners do. The important thing is that they're not required to be. My addendum to that is that it would be possible to train many, though probably not all, constables to a much higher level, but I question whether this is desirable. The expenditure of resources required to achieve that would inevitably require and result in a shift in how society views police and how they view themselves within their own organizations in a deeply illiberal direction. I spoke in an earlier video about my concerns about increasing reliance on military-style tactics and militaristic thinking among many police departments, and this ties into that component of my argument. People change their problem-solving strategies based on the sort of psychological resources available to them, and making armed action take a greater chunk of those mental and training resources is something that requires long and sober thought. So in summary of my summary, constables can't be said to need firearms more than private citizens in a way that's meaningful to this argument. They aren't required to be the sort of highly trained combat monsters that the movies and some gun control proponents would have you believe, and if it were true, then it would have serious negative effects on policing. Now at this point I want to be absolutely clear. I think I have been, but I want to make sure. I do not want cops to be incapable of defending themselves. That would be absurd. And if their training and qualification standards are insufficient to the circumstances that they regularly face, then they absolutely and urgently need revision. But using those standards to drive a wedge between the police and the general citizenry, or to build a narrative of cops as weapon users primarily, is something that no one but the most reactionary should be comfortable with. I think that's enough for today. That one single sentiment, cops need and can use firearms, but civilians don't, and therefore civilians shouldn't have access to them, has taken us on a very long roundabout trip, but I'm happy and confident that I've dealt with every implicit and explicit claim it contains, and shown it to be utter nonsense. So next time, whenever that is, I'll delve a little into the history of arms control, focusing on the UK and Japan mainly, but with a few asides to other places. Cheers.